Another good story about the history of Near Eastern archaeology involves George Smith, who his job it was, he worked in the British Museum, and his job was to piece together cuneiform tablets. And by this time, Akkadian had been deciphered, and he actually had taught himself Akkadian. The story goes that he was piecing together some cuneiform tablets. And as he started to put together these tablets here, he started to read them. And the tablets told of a story of a man named Utnapishtim, who is instructed by a god, or actually several gods, to build a boat and load it with animals in order to save them, himself and his family, from a catastrophic flood that was going to occur. And what George Smith was reading was a version of the biblical flood story. And supposedly, he was so excited and almost suffered what we might call like a nervous breakdown. He tore off all his clothes and started running around the British Museum completely naked. Couldn't get a hold of himself. And why he was so excited is because this was revolutionary. Just at the time, in the 1800s, that Darwin had published Origin of Species, more and more fossil finds are being found. Now an archaeologist was reading essentially a version of the flood story with a different character from a different place, but nearby, right, Mesopotamia, from around the same time that the biblical account was written down. And this raised a lot of questions. Does this support the biblical story? Does it refute or conflict with the biblical story? What to make of it? But so this was a revolutionary thing, and what he actually was looking at was a version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll talk about in class. And this flood narrative, even though this particular copy dates to around the time period of the Bible, the story itself goes back before the time of the Bible. And we'll talk about that. Okay, some of the Europeans who pioneered excavation work and really made archaeology a scientific discipline were many of the German archaeologists who worked in the Middle East. One in particular, Robert Koldewey, who excavated in Babylon as well as other cities. These Germans pioneered, and here you can see some of the walls of Babylon, which are now in the Berlin Museum, pioneered the use of systematic excavation, right? Rather than digging large holes, going back layer by layer. Also taking notice of mud bricks. Previously, people would just dig through the soil and the mud bricks of the walls themselves and leave these giant gaping holes in the tells. And you'll see some pictures of that. The Germans were the first ones to pioneer the technique of finding these mud brick walls, outlining them, tracing them, and then excavating them with them in place. Okay, jump to the 20th century. Still, archaeologists were concerned mainly with culture history. There was still a lot of unknowns about Sumerian history, Babylonian, Assyrian history, and this was the main focus: pottery typology and chronology and things like that. Some of the notable figures in the early 20th century, one was Gertrude Bell, who was an archaeologist, and then she became involved after World War I with the founding of the modern nation of Iraq, and then also the founding of the Baghdad Museum to showcase the natural treasures and patrimony of the new nation of Iraq. And so this was, as we're going to C was part of nation building, the use of archaeology to create sort of identity of people belonging to a modern, secular state. Also, Leonard Woolley, we'll talk about him. He excavated at a city called Ur, which is mentioned in the Bible, and he excavated one of the most famous finds ever in Mesopotamian archaeology, and that is the royal cemetery and the royal tombs of Ur. I'll mention another character just to kind of show you that the archaeologists were sort of at some points in history were sort of a mishmash collection of, adventurers and diplomats. Leonard Woolley was a fully trained archaeologist by this time. There were academic departments in England, such as in Cambridge, so he could get actually a degree in archaeology at that point. So in the late 1800s, we start to see the professionalization of archaeology becoming a real academic discipline. All right, I'll point out this person over here next to Leonard Woolley digging at a site called Carchemish, which is only a short distance away from where I worked when I was a graduate student on the Euphrates. He's an interesting character, and I'll just kind of mention him. His name was Thomas Edward Lawrence. He was an Oxford student who worked on this excavation. Part of the reason of this for this excavation was not only to dig this ancient city, but also to keep an eye on the German engineers who were building a railroad for the Ottoman Empire at that time. This was before World War I. The British and as well as other European powers anticipated a war coming. So he was essentially doing intelligence work at the same time as archaeology, or spying, whatever you'd like to call it. But Thomas Edward Lawrence is, of course, known by another name because of what he did in World War I, which has helped to organize, along with Arab leaders, the Arab revolt against Ottoman Turks. So you probably have guessed Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was actually started out as an archaeologist before he became, I guess you would call him a guerrilla leader in World War I. So kind of an interesting side note to archaeology. Leonard Woolley in the 1920s excavated Ur in southern Mesopotamia. We'll talk about the treasures from the royal tombs of Ur. They predate the tomb of Tutankhamun by 1,000 years. They're some of the most famous objects of the Sumerian civilization. Another kind of interesting tangent I will point out is that another archaeologist who worked with Leonard Woolley and then became a famous archaeologist on his own was a guy named Max Mallowan. And during his excavations in Ur, he met a recently divorced mystery writer named Agatha Christie. Most of you guys, I'm sure, have heard of Agatha Christie. Well, Agatha Christie and Max Mallowan got married, and Agatha Christie based some of her famous mystery stories in the Middle East. In fact, there was one based on Ur called Murder in Mesopotamia, where Leonard Woolley's wife, it's believed she was the inspiration for the figure in the novel who gets killed, the murder victim. Supposedly, Agatha Christie said that all women should marry archaeologists because the older you get, the more they like you. No one knows if that's really true or not, if she really said it or not. But again, another sort of interesting side note. When you read some of her stories, you get a little flavor of what it's like to work on an excavation in the Middle East in the 1920s. Between World War I and World War II, this is when we see a lot more of these excavations in the Middle East. At this point, there were agreements between academic institutions in the United States as well as Europe and governments in the Middle East for sharing of antiquities. Obviously, that stopped after World War II, and when the countries in the Middle East realized how much they were losing in terms of things being brought to museums outside of the region. The University of Chicago at this time developed the Oriental Institute. One of the readings talks about this archaic Western term of Orient, meaning not just China and Japan and Korea, but anything east of Europe. So talking about the Middle East and the Far East as part of all part of the Orient. Well, the Oriental Institute was set up at the University of Chicago to study the ancient cultures of the Middle East and to do archaeology work. And between World War I and World War II, some major excavations took place. Now, each time I teach this class, at the end of the semester, I like to organize a field trip to the Oriental Institute to visit the museum. I don't know if that will happen this semester. I hope so, but we'll have to see. If the museum is opened up by April something, and most of us have our vaccines, or we can do this somehow with social distancing, then I think we'll do it. We'll see how it goes, though. It's a wonderful museum, and again, here you can see one of these Lamassu. Really impressive collections from Egypt, ancient Persia, Mesopotamia. The Oriental Institute led excavations at that site of Khorsabad, the fortress of Sargon. They excavated Lamassu and shipped it back home to Chicago, to the museum, where actually they were building the museum at the point it was being excavated. And the excavator had to wire the museum and say, don't complete the back wall of this gallery because we have a sculpture that will never fit through the front door. So you're going to have to build the wall after we get that, impressive, gypsum sculpture in there. There's also reliefs showing Sennacherib and King Sargon. The Oriental Institute conducted excavations at Tel Asmar in a place called Kafaje, which we're going to talk about, from the Sumerian civilization. They excavated a number of these votive statues from outside the temple. This was also a time period where a guy by the name of Samuel Noah Kramer popularized Sumerian culture by writing popular books for people on the ancient literature and history of the Sumerians, and we'll look at some of the things that he published as well. Okay, jump forward to the 1960s. This was a big change in American archaeology. You probably have, if you've taken Anthropology 215 or Anthropology 220, you probably have heard about the new archaeology or the processual archaeology. This is scientific archaeology. This is trying to, again, rather than just say, okay, we have a gap in our timeline between when King Sargon was king and Assurbanipal was king. Let's see if we can fill in that time gap by excavating this site, right? Rather than focus on culture history, archaeologists like Robert Braidwood, who was from the University of Chicago, wanted to focus on process of change, which is why this is also called processual archaeology. So ask big picture anthropological questions like, why did the domestication of plants and animals occur in the Middle East at a particular time? How did it occur? What were the motivating factors? Can we generate a hypothesis, collect data, and test our hypothesis? Do it in a scientific, rigorous manner. This was really the first time archaeology had been done this way. As you read in the Matthews chapter, he talks about this, and really this is, is the way archaeologists do their work today, right? That is, you don't excavate just to excavate. If you want to get funding to dig at a site, you have to have a research question. And it can't just be, I want to fill in this time gap. It has to be something like, why did this empire collapse? Or what was the power of the kings based on during this period? That sort of thing. It has to have a large research question. So Robert Braidwood was interested in agriculture. As we'll see, you could generate lots of different hypotheses to explain why agriculture occurred in the Middle East. You might say, well, maybe the population got bigger and they needed more food, right? Well, he believed, as we're going to see when we talk about theories of agriculture, he believed that agriculture occurred where the natural wild plants and animals grew. He believed that people domesticated plants and animals because they got better over time in dealing with these animals. And he actually excavated a site in northern Iraq called Jarmo. He found a very early Neolithic agricultural village. And according to at least what he found, he thought his hypothesis was supported. So from this time on, people did kind of a scientific approach to archaeology. In the 1970s and 80s, there was kind of a reaction to processual archaeology, saying, there's lots of things that have been ignored, such as gender and class and things like that processual archaeologists don't look at. We also need to look at those things, and they called that movement post-processual archaeology. And that also was very influential, and we incorporate that in archaeology today as well. So today in America, we really do a combination of processual and post-processual archaeology in tandem. 1950s, we start to see more and more Iraqis, Syrians, Turkish academics and professors working at sites in their study region. Fuad Safar, we're going to talk about some of the famous excavations at a site called Eridu, which is one of the earliest sites in southern Iraq. And so we can see that the discipline started to expand. So we moved away from just cultural history to post-processual archaeology and processual archaeology. Now, there are classes that you can take that are still much in line with culture history. I've took a few of these classes as an undergrad and a grad student, and they were very different from an anthropology class. For example, I took a class where essentially the class was, here's the site of blank, this is what it looks like, this is what the pottery looks like, this is what the architecture looks like. Okay, let's go to the next site. This is where it's located. This is what the architecture looks like. This is what the pottery looks like. But not so much an emphasis or even bringing up the questions of why did agriculture develop? So very, very different from what I was used to. Right? Archaeology in Mesopotamia specifically, also in Syria, local archaeologists and outside archaeologists went pretty well in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But after the beginning of the first Gulf War in 91, many excavations stopped, and only recently have some resumed. But as you guys probably know, during the Second Iraq War in 2003, there was a lot of damage to archaeological sites, as well as the looting of the Baghdad Museum, which could have been prevented. But this was one of the tragedies of Mesopotamian archaeology. Some of those artifacts have never been regained. Some have been regained, but they were damaged. Some sites have been looted so poorly or so badly that they can't even be salvaged. And so archaeology today in Mesopotamia is at a little bit of a downward point, but hopefully will improve in the near future. Right? But archaeological work is still going on in the Middle East in general. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about this week is ethnoarchaeology. Before we start getting into the actual meat of the subject, Right? This week we're looking at the history of archaeology, a little bit of how archaeology is done. Ethnoarchaeology helps us understand how sites form in the Middle East, how those tells form. We've already seen some of those pictures of tells, right? They're called tells in Arabic, tepe in Persian, and huyuk in Turkish, right? You can easily spot a tell. They stick up, right? Here's a very obvious tell, right? Completely flat, and you have a mound that's over 100 feet high, right? Very, very large mound sticking up there. So we talked a little bit about how tells form, but how does the understanding of mud bricks and mud brick villages, how does this actually help us excavate a tell? Right? Okay, well, let's look in more detail at the building of a mud brick village, the abandonment, and then what this tells us about how excavation is done. Okay, here's the making of mud bricks. In a typical village, I'm going to show you some pictures from a village in Syria. When you're getting ready to build your house, you get out of the mold, you collect soil, and you collect clay and water, and you mix it up, and you start patting down the mixture into the molds, removing the molds, letting the bricks dry in the sun, and they bake very, very hard. Right? The clay helps keep them together. Now, a source of soil and clay could actually be a tell. Right? That is, if you're living in the village next to a tell, right? So at some point, people moved off of the tell, but next to it, and you're living in this village and you're looking for some dirt to make mud bricks, and there's a big mound of dirt next to you, you're going to use that to make these mud bricks. Now, this is how some of the earliest ancient artifacts were found by outsiders. Europeans coming in and traveling to mud brick villages noticed artifacts sticking in the bricks of current houses. Now they realized that these artifacts had nothing to do with the buildings, right? And this is important for archaeologists, because if you're ever digging an ancient site and you are digging a mud brick wall and you find an artifact in that wall, you know that that artifact does not have a connection to the actual building. It's been taken out of its original context. Right? Okay. Once you build your house, it could be multiple stories high. When you look at a place like Yemen, you can see really intricate multi-story mud brick structures. 6 stories, 7 stories, pretty impressive. Looking at ethnoarchaeology is using modern-day ethnography to answer archaeological questions. From looking at modern villages in the Middle East, what ethnoarchaeologists understood is that the roofs of houses in these villages are areas of a lot of activity, where things are produced, things are dried out, right? So there's actually lots of activity areas on the roofs. They also learned about artifacts that they couldn't identify the function of before, such as these stone cylinders that they saw that were on the roofs, were used to actually tamp down the roof after some rain. If the rain actually started to melt away some of the mud on the roof, you'd use that roller to kind of even things out again. Right? So the way you would build a house is collect your bricks. If you have a stone foundation, the building will last longer. If you don't, it won't last as long, because moisture from the ground will seep up into the bricks slowly over time. A mud brick house typically will last about 50 years, possibly longer if it's kept in good repair. If the bricks are baked in a kiln, then those bricks will last pretty much forever. But that's labor intensive, and it's easy just to use sun-dried bricks, which is mainly what they did in ancient Mesopotamia, except for important buildings, which they would use baked clay bricks. Here you can see them stacking up the bricks, course after course. Now there's not a lot of wood in the Middle East, and it means that whenever a house was abandoned, the wood would be recycled, which means that wood that you find in archaeological contexts may be older than the building it was in, because wood is typically recycled. But they have to use poplar wood here for lintels and door jambs and door frames and window frames and things like that. Here you can see the house getting higher and higher. Then for the roof, they lay the roof beams on top again. We'll add some thatch and straw. You can see them getting that mixture ready. Might plaster or put mud and clay on the outside, and then they will also put mud on top of the roof, and you would have a mud brick house. Now, it rains obviously in northern Mesopotamia in the Fertile Crescent area. There's enough rainfall for agriculture, but there's not enough rain. There's not too much rainfall that this house is going to melt. It's dry enough there that you're not going to get, torrential rainstorms or the rains that we kind of see in Michigan in the spring. A mud brick house would not last in Michigan, obviously. It will last in the Middle East. Now, typically, the first thing to go wrong in a mud brick house is the roof. The roof is usually infested by vermin like rodents or bugs like scorpions, and at a certain point, you can't live there anymore. You may not try and put a new roof on. You might just decide, well, the house is old anyway, and it's in bad shape, and the bricks are crumbling. We're just going to abandon it, which is what sometimes happens. Ethnoarchaeology has shown us that the courtyards are also big activity areas for food processing and things like that. And we know what some of the ancient ovens look like. This is an oven right here. This is an oven. It's used to bake bread. A lot of times in the archaeological sites, you'll find a circle of clay in the outside the house or inside the house with ash in it. And based on ethnoarchaeology, we know it's probably a bread oven. So what they would do is have a fire in here. They'd roll out the dough. They'd put the dough up on the inside. It would stick to the wall and get baked. And it would be something like naan that you would have, let's say, in an Indian restaurant. The word for bread in Persian is also naan. And you can have bread in the Middle East that's pretty much identical to the naan that you see in Indian restaurants. It's, a very similar kind of flatbread. There are many different kinds of bread in the Middle East today, and this is one version. And other kinds of ovens. Right? So you have a village. There's in the streets, you'd have different activities and different things going on. And then once the house was abandoned, you recycle the wood. There's no roof, so rains will pour in, and people will throw their trash in there. Right? It's a big empty house. It's not good for anything else, except maybe to keep your animals, but for a little bit, but also for trash. Trash would build up, and then eventually the walls would collapse completely, like so. Then people would build right on top of it, and over time, year after, generation after generation, new trash and buildings, you would end up having a tell, right? So here you might have something like a Neolithic levels, and then Bronze Age levels, and then Iron Age levels, and then Islamic levels on top, something like that. Now, based on ethnoarchaeology, we know how to excavate a mud brick house well, because we know that once you start excavating, you're going to find trash. That is bricks that have fallen, stuff that people have thrown in, until you get to something that looks like the roof. Once you find the roof, you know that anything below the roof is from when the house was originally used. So you'll slow down and be very, very careful at that point. And so because of ethnoarchaeology, we know a more scientifically rigorous way of excavating these buildings.